specifically during the years of the Great Depression, when the Great Depression was really, really heavy, between 29 and 35 maybe, during those years, political and economic liberalism was discredited, and in its place emerged popularity for alternatives to liberal democracy and liberal economics, right? So you had, for example, the Stalin regime in Russia was legitimated by the discreditation of economic and political liberalism, right? People looked the other way, right? Yeah, and then the problem was, and then Stalin used this sort of like opportunity to implement policies such as forced collectivization, which led to the Holodomor, right? Holodomor, which is like the I believe 7 million Ukrainians were, I don't know, starved or whatever because of forced collectivization. Unfortunately, the reason Stalin felt confidence to implement that policy is because of the discreditation of liberal economic, theories after the fall of the crash of 29. And then, of course, Mussolini's Italy weathered the Great Depression, because Mussolini had adopted corporativistic economic policies, right? The economic system of corporativism, which is like a third position between so-called communism, or Stalin called his system Soviet socialism, so-called Soviet socialism, which is not really socialism, and it was certainly not communism, and liberal capitalism, which was discredited by the Great Depression, right, and the crash of 29. So because of that, among right-wingers, the appeal of economic liberalism receded and the appeal of corporativism grew. So, and there were also progressive alternatives to liberalism, economic and political liberalism, that emerged in the 30s, especially in Spain, right? In Spain, you had the emergence of the anarcho-syndicalist movement, a very strong anarcho-syndicalist movement, which, whose agenda was the achievement of social revolution, and that social revolution was supposed to deliver the voluntary association of cooperative groups, which would implicit in that would be, the abolition of the Spanish state, right, and the Spanish monarchy and the Spanish state, and even the republic itself eventually would be abolished. But at first, the movement towards the anarcho-syndicalist social revolution was contextualized by the Spanish Republic. But that's something else. And then also you had, of course, the emergence of dissident Marxism. Dissident Marxism was popular in the 1930s precisely because of the discreditation of economic liberalism and political liberalism, right? Political liberalism was discredited, and people didn't see in political liberalism a real alternative, or a critical alternative to Stalin's so-called Soviet socialism. So a lot of people looked to, the two variables of dissident Marxism available at the time, which were Leon Trotsky's Fourth International and the Amsterdam International, which incorporated both the Independent Labour Party in Britain, of which George Orwell was a member. His real name was Eric Blair, and the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista in Spain, which was led by Andrés Nin, right? So, yeah, I mean, the discreditation of economic and political liberalism in that time period was, led to bad things, such as, the popularity of Mussolini, and Stalin's implementation of forced collectivization, which led to like the Holodomor, and probably also the purges between 36 and 38, which Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about in Gulag Archipelago. He talks a lot about 1937 in that book. That too was probably made possible by the fact that liberalism was discredited, in the 1930s, because the mood was that Soviet socialism was cool or whatever, and it was okay to to take any measures possible to protect it were okay, including Stalin purged 3 million members of the CPSU were either executed or sent to the Gulag, right? So that is actually an outgrowth of liberalism being discredited. But there was among those who defended liberalism, classical liberalism, were of course the people associated with the Austrian school, right? The Austrian school never gave in, right? The Austrian school at the time did not capitulate. They redoubled their defense of classical liberalism, but they presented their defense of classical liberalism as a critique of what they think was Marxism, but what's actually Soviet socialism, which was Stalinism and not real Marxism, but they thought it was Marxism. Their critique of the Soviet system and their critique of Nazi and fascist and then Nazi economics, right? So yeah, so that is what is useful to look at. Yeah. So I mean, if you want a thorough criticism of Stalin's Soviet socialism, you look at Leon Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed, and you look at period contextualized criticisms of the Soviet system coming out of the Austrian school, right? Right. Anyhow, we can get now into chapter 4 of the fall of liberalism, right? And the chapter starts, of all the developments in the age of catastrophe, survivors from the 19th century were perhaps most shocked by the collapse of the values and institutions of the liberal civilization, whose progress their century had taken for granted, at any rate in advanced and advancing parts of the world. Advanced and advancing at the time were probably Europe, United States, right? Yeah. So yeah, the values and institutions of the liberal civilization of the 19th century, right? The late 19th century, this side of industrialization, maybe, perhaps, really this side of the Enlightenment, yeah, the idea of, liberal civilization in that sense, yeah, those values became discredited, because of excess during the 1920s boom, and then because of the crash of 29, which discredited economic liberalism. Yeah, but before 1914, these values had been challenged only by traditionalist forces like the Roman Catholic Church, building defensive barricades of dogma against the superior forces of modernity, right? So the Roman Catholic reaction to Enlightenment liberalism was rejection of modernity, right? Dogmatic rejection of modernity. Yeah, so and Eric HOBSBAWM considers the period between 1914 and 1918, World War I, to be the eruption of barbarism, right? But barbarism, the period of barbarism, or the age of catastrophe, would have been between 1914 and 1945. World War I, intervallic period, World War II. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more in this chapter. What I want to get to, okay, here it is. This is the paragraph that is interesting. Political liberalism was in full retreat throughout the age of catastrophe, 1914 to 1945, a retreat which accelerated sharply after Adolf Hitler became Germany's chancellor in 1933. Taking the world as a whole, there had been perhaps 35 or more constitutional and elected governments in 1920. Until 1938, there were perhaps 17 such states. In 1944, perhaps 12 out of the global total of 64. The world trend seemed clear. Okay, so that's, yeah. So the number of, and the Trotskyists will call bourgeois democracy, right? Countries where constitutional and elected governments existed shrunk. The number shrunk between 1920 and 1944. Okay. Yeah, and this is an argument that HOBSBAWM makes, which, I think this is subjective. It may be worth reminding ourselves that in this period the threat to liberal institutions came exclusively from the political right. For between 1945 and 1989, it was assumed almost as a matter of course that it came essentially from communism, right? So yeah. So between 1914 and 1945, the threat to liberal institutions came exclusively from the political right. And the West considered that between 1945 and 1989, it came essentially from so-called communism. So-called communism. The Soviet Union was not communist. It never achieved communism. So communism is a mode of production where the state has withered away. And that was clearly not the case in the Soviet Union, where the state was actually a totalitarian entity. So, right. So, the term totalitarianism, originally invented as a description or self-description of Italian fascism, was applied virtually only to such regimes, right-wing regimes. Soviet Russia from 1923, the USSR, was isolated by neither able nor after the rise of Stalin willing to extend communism. Social revolution under Leninist or any leadership ceased to spread after the initial post-war wave had ebbed. And that is one of the things that Trotsky criticized, right? About why Trotsky rejected the Comintern. And you see that in a document called the Transitional Program, where he criticizes the Comintern. That's why. Because according to Trotsky, it retreated from social revolution. Right. Yeah, the fear of social revolution and the communist role in it was realistic enough, as the second wave of revolution during and after the Second World War proved. But in the 20 years of liberal retreat, not a single regime that could be reasonably called liberal democratic had been overthrown from the left. Okay, so between, well, and the Spanish Republic doesn't count because the Spanish Republic did not result from the overthrow of anybody. Well, depends on how you look at it. Because when they proclaimed the Republic, the king, the monarchy was okay. Yeah, maybe okay. They overthrew, objectively they overthrew the monarchy, right? And they set up the Republic, and in the Republic there were the Communist Party and the anarchists in the street, and the anarchists proceeded to collectivize industries and what have you. And the communists were and the socialists and the communists were in the government and what have you. Yeah, I don't know. The danger came exclusively from the right, and that right represented not merely a threat to constitutional and representative government, but an ideological threat to liberal civilization as such, and a potentially worldwide movement for which the label fascism is both insufficient and not wholly irrelevant. So yeah, I don't know. But I'm sorry, what motivated, one other thing other than the discrediting of liberalism, what motivated the growth of popularity for fascism and Nazism was the perceived threat of communism, so-called communism, right? Fear of communism, especially among the middle and upper classes. So so fascism in Italy was seen as a way to prevent communism, right? It was fascism is a credible alternative to the discredited liberalism that will prevent communism. That was the argument for Mussolini, basically, in a nutshell. Right. Fascism, first in its original Italian form, later in its German form of National Socialism, both inspired other anti-liberal forces, supported them, and lent the international right a sense of historic confidence. In the 1930s, it looked like the wave of the future, right? Fascism was the wave of the future in the 1930s, right? Because liberalism was discredited. Many people on the right, they were like, we don't want to have anything more to do with economic liberalism. We want corporativism instead. Except for the Austrian school. So the Austrian school was isolated and alone, whatever, fighting against the current, but they fought the fight, right? They openly criticized Nazi economics. Von Mises criticized Nazi economics. And also the Trotskyists on the other side of the spectrum, the Trotskyists, the Fourth International, and the dissident Marxists like Andres Nin and Leon Trotsky denounced the Stalin regime and fascism too, because Trotsky wrote a pamphlet, very famous, Fascism, What Is It and How to Fight It, right? So, yeah. So yeah, about the only hope in that era of what Hobsbawm calls the age of catastrophe, I would say, were the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists, the Trotskyists, the Amsterdam International, and the Austrian School. That's it. But yeah, that's my marker for this book. Berlin in 1930. Yeah. So let's see. I want to consider here though. Okay, fascism itself, the analysis of fascism by Hobsbawm. Consider that critically. And, the whole fall of liberalism, discrediting of liberalism, which contextualizes, the emergence of the Nazi economic system, which Mises criticizes in the other video. Right. Okay. Movements which can be truly called fascist. And in the previous section, Hobsbawm differentiates that there are, radical right was not the same as fascist, okay, at that time period. But radical right is beyond the scope of this video because I'm interested in not fascism. Right, okay. The movements which can be truly called fascist. The first of these was the Italian one, which gave the phenomenon its name, the creation of a renegade socialist journalist, Benito Mussolini, whose first name, attributed to the Mexican anti-clerical president Benito Juarez, symbolized the passionate anti-papalism of his native Romagna. Adolf Hitler himself acknowledged his debt to and respect for Mussolini, even when both Mussolini and fascist Italy had demonstrated their feebleness and incompetence in the Second World War. And another person who admired Mussolini was, of course, Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina, right? In many features of Argentinian Justicialismo, because Argentinian Justicialism, which is the official ideology of the Peronist movement in Argentina, is modeled on the theories of Benito Mussolini, the third positionism of Italian corporativism, and that is because Juan Domingo Perón was an admirer of Mussolini. People who say that Eva Peron was a socialist, take note. Eva Peron was not a socialist. Okay, Eva Peron was a populist she was technically a fascist populist, a social fascist populist, because her efforts at or whatever at setting up welfare systems and schemes was at the service of a regime of her husband, who was an admirer of Mussolini and whose ideology of Justicialismo was modeled on Mussolini's corporativism. Okay, but whatever, and I know a lot of people are gonna come after me because I said this. I basically just lost the Argentinian left. But it's okay. They're far away. I'm up here in Sweden. They're far away over there. So they can lynch me. But yeah. Right. Yeah, and this is interesting. Mussolini took over from Hitler rather late in the day. The anti-Semitism, which had been totally absent from his movement before 1938, and that is correct. Italian fascism was not anti-Semitic, not originally. That was imposed. Mussolini had to adopt that after 1938. Because probably my guess is that probably Hitler demanded that he did that because, in order to make Italy's participation in the anti-Comintern axis, Hitler probably wanted some consistency from Mussolini on that issue. And yeah, Italian fascism alone did not exercise much international attraction, even though it tried to inspire and finance similar movements elsewhere, right? So, yeah. Yeah, without the triumph of Hitler in Germany in early 1933, fascism would not have become a general movement. In fact, all the fascist movements outside Italy that amounted to anything were founded after his arrival in power, notably the Hungarian Arrow Cross, which scored 25% of votes in the first secret ballot ever held in Hungary in 1939, and the Romanian Iron Guard, whose real support was even greater. So outside of Hungary and Romania, efforts to transplant fascism didn't really pan out. But I guess that was a joke. I don't know why he did that, but whatever. Indeed, even movements virtually financed entirely by Mussolini, like the Croatian Ustashi terrorists of Ante Pavelic, did not gain much ground and became ideologically fascisticized until the 1930s, when part of them also looked for inspiration and finance to Germany, right? Without Hitler's triumph in Germany, the idea of fascism as a universal movement, a sort of right-wing equivalent to international communism, with Berlin as its Moscow, would not have developed. Okay. This did not produce a serious movement, but only during the Second World War, ideologically motivated collaborators with the Germans in occupied Europe, right? Yeah, like in, or like in Spain, the Blue Division volunteers or what have you. I don't know. Yeah, let's see what else it says here. Yeah, theory was not the strong point of movements devoted to the inadequacies of reason and rationalism and the superiority of instinct and will, right? Mussolini was a theorist because he wrote a book about it, fascism, theory and practice. And I mean, Mussolini wrote books and articles and gave speeches outlining the theoretical grounding for fascist economic and political and social policy. But, Mussolini could have readily dispensed with his house philosopher Giovanni Gentile, right? And Hitler probably neither knew nor cared about the support of the philosopher Heidegger, right? Fascism cannot be identified either with a particular form of state organization, such as the corporate state. And this is where I disagree with HOBSBAWM. I disagree with this statement. I'm gonna quote him, but I disagree with this statement. Fascism cannot be identified either with a particular form of state organization, such as the corporate state. Nazi Germany lost interest in such ideas rapidly, all the more since they conflicted with the idea of a single, undivided, and total people's community. Okay, all right, let's take the people. Okay, where I disagree with HOBSBAWM on this. Originally, Hitler based, when it was the government, okay, when Hitler took power in 1933, it was the government of national concentration, right? Where all the cabinet members were, right-wing conservatives and nationalists, non-Nazi, right? Non-Nazi conservatives and nationalists. I think it was only, what's his name? The fat one. What was his name? The one that took over the Air Force. Goring. Goring was chief of police and Hitler was chancellor, and everybody else in the cabinet was from like a nationalist or a conservative that wasn't really Nazi. In that period, the economic policies of the Nazi regime were, Keynesian, right? In that first period. Later on, after Hindenburg died and Hitler took over, and Hitler, merged the office of president and chancellor and became Führer, then at that point, Hitler did implement corporativistic policies derived from Mussolini, okay? And that, that sort of transition period up until about 1938 was necessary, a precursor to then implementing the Nazis' own version of the social model, which was the people's community. So, so first it was a form of Keynesianism, then it was Italian corporativism, and then it was the people's community. Okay, so there were stages. I mean, Hitler didn't just Hitler didn't just pull out the people's community out of his ass and impose. No, there was a process that led to the people's community. So HOBSBAWM doesn't really talk about this. Right. And I get the reason is because the traditional explanation among HOBSBAWM was like a member. I don't know. He was pro-Soviet. I'm not sure if he was a member of the Communist Party or not. But obviously, people who are like into the Soviet Union or what have you, they always say that fascism is a form of capitalism, right? And I disagree with that. Fascism is not capitalism. Okay. I mean, I disagree with von Mises that the Nazi economic system was socialism, and I disagree with communists who say that the Nazi economic system was capitalism. Okay, it was not capitalism. It was neither capitalism, and it was certainly not socialism. It was something on its own, a corporative. In Nazi Germany, the people's community prefaced with corporativism and Keynesian measures. Okay, but that, and as Mises points out in his article, you know, the businessmen in Nazi Germany were like shop managers. You know, they were not entrepreneurs; they were shop managers. And you know, as far as the relationship of the Nazi state with the big German conglomerates like IG Farben or like Messerschmitt or like IBM, Fanta. I mean, they're which was Coca-Cola. They changed their name to Fanta in Nazi Germany. The relationship of the Nazi state with these entities was definitely modeled on the relationship of Mussolini to corporativistic entities in Italy. Okay, so I don't know. There are a lot of elements of Italian corporativism in the Nazi model, even though the official line was the people's community, which was a form of a radical integralism. Okay, because Mussolini in his book, Fascism Theory and Practice, Mussolini defines, you know, fascism is the dictatorship of the state over the cooperative mass, right? And in fascism, the individual, fascism being a form of anti-liberalism, denies the importance of the individual. The individual is subsumed into the cooperative mass through the process of integralism, right? It's an integralistic thing where it's an organic entity. The cooperative mass is that is governed by the fascist state. Is an organic entity, you know. And then the individual is subsumed into this cooperative mass. Now, in Nazism, that concept of integralism and the cooperative mass was radicalized, and then what comes out is the concept of the people's community, right? Which is a very radical version of you know, I don't know, organic entity, right? So you can find, yeah, I mean, right. I'm not going to like. I'm going to pull a hypothesis out of my ass that, you know, the Swedish social democrat concept of the people's home, which was the original model of the Swedish model, was probably derived from integralistic ideas developed in fascist Italy. Okay, because first of all, the people's home and then the people's community, you know, if it barks like a dog, it's probably a dog, you know. And then you have you know, in Sweden, Swedes do not call themselves citizens of Sweden or subjects of the Swedish crown. They call themselves members of Sweden, right? And that's for a reason, because again, the Swedish Social Democrats, when they created this concept of the people's home, which now they have replaced with the concept of the open society, they conceptualize of the Swedish samhället as an organic entity, right? To be governed by the Social Democrats, right? Bread and freedom, or what have you. Where the Social Democrat bureaucrats will stand people in line, appoint a policeman to control the line, and then hand out goodies and decide who gets what and who doesn't. That's, you know, like Leon Trotsky talked about the Soviet nomenclatura. So, so the Swedish, you know, system or whatever, the original model of this people's home was probably like that. Some sort of social democratic version of the people's community, but with the semantics changed because it was set up after the Second World War, and they replaced community with home. But it's the same mentality of integralism. And today, you know, the Swedish Social Democrats, you know, are parroting the talk about integration. You know, the immigrants must be integrated. You know, the obsession with integrating the immigrants. That's also part of the integralistic theories, you know, derived ultimately from fascist Italy. You know, remember what HOBSBAWM, you know, in the 1930s, when the Swedish Social Democrats were probably formulating all these theories that then they implemented after the war, fascism was popular, integralism was popular. Remember, liberalism had been discredited. And it is possible that the Swedish Social Democrats, in order to make themselves popular or whatever, or like, you know, because like HOBSBAWM says, fascism was the wave of the future, right? So maybe the Swedish Social Democrats said, hey, this is the wave of the future, this integralism stuff. Let's borrow some ideas from it, right? And then they came up with the idea of the Swedish samhället and membership as opposed to citizenship, you know, integration, which integration is more later with the immigrants, but, you know, whatever, you know. Let's see. Back to fascism. Fascism shared nationalism, anti-communism, anti-liberalism with other non-fascist elements of the right, right? Yeah. Several of these, notably among the non-fascist French reactionary groups, also shared with it a preference for politics as street violence, right? So, yeah. Yeah, fascism gloried in the mobilization of the masses and maintained it symbolically in the form of the public theater, right? The Nuremberg rallies, the masses on the Piazza Venezia looking up to Mussolini's gestures on his balcony, even when it came to power, as also did communist movements. And another one who used to do this, you know, public theater was, of course, Juan Domingo Perón. Again, Juan Domingo Perón, allá en Buenos Aires, you know, when he came out into the balcony, the masses came out and, you know, ¿cómo es que decían? Esta plaza es de Perón. This square belongs to Perón or whatever. You know, like that. Theater. The theater of fascism, right? The masses and what have you. You know, idolizing the leader. That's, you know, very much the Führer principle or what have you. Right. Fascists were the revolutionaries of counter-revolution in their rhetoric, in their appeal to those who considered themselves victims of society, in their call for a total transformation of society, even in their deliberate adaptation of the symbols and names of their social revolutionaries, which is so obvious in Hitler's National Socialist Workers' Party, with its modified red flag and its immediate institution of the Reds' 1st of May as an official holiday in 1933, right? So yeah, I mean, Hitler went to town co-opting all the symbols of the left, right? He even had the fist salute, like whatever, I think at one point. No, originally they did, but then they replaced it with the, you know, the Sieg Heil thing. But originally they used the fist salute, I think, the SA, but I think they changed to the other one. I don't know, the whatever, what have you. But, you know, when I was reading this, you know what I thought about? In Venezuela, the Maduro regime, which is a regime of hunger and repression, the Maduro regime in Venezuela, lately, this is a phenomenon that has been happening now, whatever, as Maduro has become, you know, a dictatorial entity in Venezuela. Now, and this is very similar to Joseph Stalin, okay? And actually, what's his name? Solzhenitsyn in Gulag Archipelago talks about this too. But this is what's happening in Venezuela right now with Maduro. When Maduro gives a speech, the people who are listening are required to raise the clenched fist. Okay, when Maduro gives a speech, you're supposed to like raise your clenched fist and what have you, and you gotta keep it up until Maduro stops talking, right? And even after Maduro stops talking, you gotta keep it up for a little bit, because if the monitors in the crowd, because they have monitors, all the like crowds are staged, right? Public sector workers who are forced to stand and listen to Maduro, right? They manufacture an audience or whatever for them, and then they film it or what have you in the state television, the Venezuelan state television, BTV, which has, you know, BTV used to be, you know, a force for good, and BTV has become an instrument of the propaganda of the Maduro regime. Is tragic and sad. But anyways, so you see all these crowds of people with the clenched fist when they're listening to Maduro, and that's all staged, right? And they're not allowed to take the fist down until, Maduro stops talking for a while or whatever. The same thing with Joseph Stalin. In Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn talks about this, you know, how he points to this one case when they were in, I think it was an agricultural collective or whatever, and they were supposed to clap, right? Because, I don't know, somebody gave a speech or whatever, and they were Stalin or what have you, and they were supposed to clap and clap and clap and keep clapping, and nobody could stop clapping, because if you stop clapping, the NKVD was watching, and if you stop clapping, that means that you're not enthusiastic. This is in 1937, I think. Solzhenitsyn talks about this in Gulag Archipelago. people were afraid to stop clapping because the NKVD was watching. And eventually, one guy, just the head of the collective, I think, or whatever, like, or it was a local prominent official functionary, stopped clapping and sat down. And then when he did that, the other people gradually stopped clapping and sat down. But then what happened the next day? The NKVD went for the man, the man who sat down at first, the prominent whatever functionary. He ended up in the gulag, right? So you know what I mean? So yeah, but I just wanted to talk about, because the Maduro regime in Venezuela is also doing this, what Hitler did, you know, adaptation of the symbols of social revolutionaries, right? Like the clenched fist, you know. Yeah, I just thought that as a side note about the Maduro regime in Venezuela.